1930s, when there was so much unemployment. And remember, we have an unemployment now roughly 10% official. The equivalent unemployment rate in 1933 was 25%, 2.5 times what it is now. So much more urgent to do something in a society that collapsed. Okay? So here's what Roosevelt came up with. We could put millions of people to work if we could suddenly create a demand for something that's labor intensive. Ah, I know what it is, his advisors said to him. Americans would love to have their own homes. The vast majority now live in these awful tenements in the tenement, you know, on the Lower East Side here in New York. They have a wonderful thing down there that takes you on a tour about those tenements, but it's quite an education to see how those people live, crowded and all that. Americans want a home that isn't a tenement. But of course, they don't have the money. And they can't go to the bank because the bank takes one look at them and says, I'm not lending you any money because you're a deadbeat. It's too risky to lend you money. So in the depths of the Depression, what did Roosevelt do? He created the Federal Housing Authority. He created a government agency that would guarantee to a bank that if it lent to a working class person who met certain requirements, if that working class person couldn't pay, the government would step in and make good the payments. It's the beginning of the vast production of individual homes in the United States. It created a demand for housing because suddenly working class people could get a loan. Because the government guaranteed it. So a footnote again. Why do we have a housing industry? Because the government did that. Not private enterprise. Private enterprise didn't do shit. They couldn't do it. They wouldn't do it. The government created the suburb. Because if everyone's going to have a private home, where are they going to put them? You can't do that in the city. So the ring around the city is the place where the private home, subsidized by the government, gets built. That was the only kind of credit most Americans could get. And only the upper half of the working class could qualify. You had to have a nice income, you had to have a secure job, otherwise you wouldn't get even a government subsidy. What really changed was the 1970s, and here's where the credit comes. The 1970s is when the real wages of American workers stopped rising. That is the most fundamental fact about the last 50 years of American history. It may be the most fundamental fact about all of American history. The wages stopped. The Americans who are supposed to deliver their American dream to their children, to have a nice house, a nice car, wear nice clothes, go on a nice vacation, be a nice consumer. How are you going to do that if your wages don't go up? You borrow. You created borrow. But if the wages had kept on going up, there would be no explosion of debt. There would be no need, just as there wasn't before. The explosion of debt since the 1970s is the American way of postponing the confrontation with what it means when the capitalist class no longer has to pay you rising wages, as it had to for 150 years because we had a continuous labor shortage in this country. That's why waves of immigrants came here. That's why we forced Africans to come here. That's why we had to pay higher wages, not only to get them to come here, these working people, but to get them not to run away from their industrial job to become a farmer with all that free land that we had taken away from the Indians. That's what we did. And we had to pay higher wages. That's why all the immigrants came here. In the 1970s, because of the computer, which replaced people, because of the beginning of a mass export of jobs to cheaper wages, because of women moving into the labor force, in a paid labor force in a massive way, because of more immigration, it was no longer necessary for capitalists to pay rising wages, and they jumped. They didn't pay them anymore. And the American working class was completely shocked. What? How? I promised an education to my children. I promised a car. I promised to myself, to my wife, to my husband. We could have had a nation of workers who said, okay, we're not being paid anymore, end of the consumer society, we'll just make do with what we have. Those of you that are Americans understand that is not going to happen. Moreover, it was never discussed. It was never, I won't embarrass you by asking how many of you don't know that. No one has ever told you about it. It was never discussed in America. One of the great psychological injuries done to the American people was not to explain in the 70s what had happened to the economy that ended rising wages. And why was it an injury? Because every American worker, and I mean everyone, internalized that as if it were their own personal failure. I didn't go to college. I didn't take the right courses. I haven't worked hard enough. I'm the lazy, craphead that my mother sometimes said I was. All those things. It was internalized. And that's why Americans worked more hours. Right? I told you that statistic. Americans do more paid hours of labor per year than any other working class in the world. We are exhausted physically. We are dependent on a whole lot of drugs to get us through the level of pressure and tension that we as a society have imposed or allowed to be imposed on us. So of course we borrowed money to escape. The borrowing of the last 30 years was a way to show the world, look at the car I drive. Look at the house I live in. I am the success. I can. At least the bank has confidence in me. It's the individual response to social change, because we don't have the institutions, the parties, the unions, to make a social response, a collective response that might have made it different. Some of you know that I advocate as a kind of new socialism for the 21st century, that we focus a great deal on changing the organization of enterprises. We do not have them run by a board of directors selected by major shareholders, that we take seriously the notion that the workers should run the businesses themselves. Now I ask you, if workers had run the businesses themselves in the 1970s, as their productivity kept going up, would they have stopped paying themselves rising wages? Unlikely. They would have kept right on going. And then they wouldn't have needed to borrow anything, just like they didn't need to before that. Would they have moved production out of the country? Unlikely. That would be killing your own job. Wouldn't do that. The whole history of the United States would have been completely different, and probably a lot better. So the solution to the crisis is not this or that policy. You have to go to the basis of how we got into this crisis, and you have to face up to the basic changes that would have to be necessary, not only to get out of this crisis, but not to have the next one 3 years down the road, which is the normal story for capitalism. So I don't think, to answer your question bluntly, we could have a jobs program tomorrow. If I were writing a slogan, I would say something like this: for every dollar used to bail out the banks, we now need $1 to provide work for people. We've helped out the top first. Let's help out everybody else next. That would be quite popular in the country. Teabagger. By the way, I get invited, just for case. Some of you might be surprised. The Tea Party people keep inviting me to give talks and go to their meetings. I haven't gone because I value my life, but nonetheless, but it does show you a confusion. And I think I've mentioned to you, because it seems to get a lot of laughs from people. I was invited and I appeared on the Glenn Beck show. He and I had a conversation for 7.5 minutes in front of 10 million television viewers. And it was a very agreeable conversation in which he and I agreed right down the line. I had this happening to me more and more. And he knows I'm a Marxist, but I don't hide this fact. He does not like Marxists. He made an exception in my case. He really did, and it had to do with personal things. I am friends with his mother-in-law, and so life is complicated. And because of that, I'm on the television. She told him that, and he likes her, and he therefore was in a difficult position, and she informed him that if he didn't have me on the program, he would not be welcome in her house. So I was on. I may go again. Yeah.
To go back to this currency war, what stops the EU from devaluating the euro to counter the devaluation of the dollar?
Fundamentally nothing. I mean, there are forces inside Europe who are urging that exactly that be done, that the currency war be engaged, and that the euro be pushed down to prevent the dollar from carrying out this policy. So that may win, I do not know. But here are some of the considerations. Europe buys a great deal of stuff from around the world, brings it to Europe and processes it into the things they then export. The problem with currency is it cuts both ways. If the value of the euro goes up, then the things they buy as inputs cheapen. So they can offset the danger to the price rising for their exports by bringing down the price since they have cheaper inputs. China has this process too. Much of China is buying inputs, processing them a bit, and then selling them out.